Welcome everybody. In this lecture we will be talking about chapter 5 of Chris Franklin's book, which is about the problem of luck. So I've been looking forward to this for a long time, so I'm really excited we'll be talking about the problem of luck. In the first part of this lecture, I will give you a little bit of background about indeterminism, and then I will talk about one formulation of the luck argument. And the background about indeterminism I want to give you is to illustrate how in an indeterministic world you can have some causal processes that are deterministic. And to illustrate this, let us look at a very, very simple world, which is based on Conway's game of life, which you might have heard about. So the very, very simple world only consists of a pattern of cells. So each square here is a cell, and at any given time, each cell is either white or it is black. And moreover, this pattern evolves over time, so whether a given cell is white or black can change from one moment to the next, and how the color of each cell develops is governed by a number of rules. And here I've given you two rules. And so the first rule says that if a white cell has one or fewer black neighboring cells, it will stay white. Every white cell that has no black neighbor or only one black neighbor will stay white. For example, this cell here will stay white, and this cell here will stay white. But rule 2 tells us that if a white cell has two or more black neighboring cells, then there's a 50% chance that it will turn black and a 50% chance that it will stay white. For example, this white cell here has two black neighbors, and so there's a 50% chance that in the next moment it will still be white and a 50% chance that it will turn black. Ideally, we'll also have rules about how the black cells will evolve, but those won't interest us. What's important for now is that given these rules, you already know that this world here is indeterministic because the current state of the world right here and these rules don't logically entail the next state because we have these probabilities here. It doesn't logically follow from this state here and these rules what color this cell here will have in the next instance. But there are other processes here that are perfectly deterministic. For example, it's perfectly determined that this cell here, given that it has no black neighbor, it's totally determined that this cell here will still be white in the next instance. That's just to give you an illustration of how even in a world that's overall indeterministic, because there are at least some part of it that's indeterminate, you can still have processes that are deterministic. For example, how the color of this cell here develops. So that's all the background I wanted to give you, and now we can move on to the problem of luck. And the problem of luck is the problem that if indeterminism is true, then on the face of it, it seems to take control away from us. For example, go back to this example that we already talked about, where a thief deliberates about whether he should steal money from the poor box or not, and he has reasons to steal because he really needs some money, but he also has reasons to not steal because he promised his dying mother to be a good person. And now suppose that it's up to chance, that it's indeterministic whether these reasons will cause him to take the money or will cause him to not take the money. It then seems that this actually takes control away from him because it's then not under his control, because it's not under his control how these chances will play out, and so how he will act is up to chance, and that seems to take control away from him. And the way how Franklin addresses the problem of luck is that he looks at 4 precise versions of spelling out the problem and then arguing that neither formulation poses any kind of problem for libertarianism. So none of these formulations shows that chance really is incompatible with free agency. And of these 4 formulations, I will only talk about 3 because the first formulation, the no causation formulation, is not really one that's taken very seriously these days. So I think we can set this one aside. So in the remainder of this lecture, I will talk about the insurance formulation. And the insurance formulation is built on the intuitive idea that if an action is undetermined, by the agent's prior states, then the agent cannot ensure, the agent cannot guarantee that the action will happen. But if the agent cannot ensure that the action will happen, then the action is not really up to him. It's up to luck whether the action will happen or not, and so the action is not done freely because the agent wasn't able to guarantee it, and so it wasn't really up to him whether he performed the action or not. And Franklin gives a more precise formulation of the argument by splitting it up into 3 premises and a conclusion. And you can see the argument here, which I've copied and pasted from the readings. And Franklin's way of questioning the argument is by focusing on the notion of being able to ensure that an action will happen. And this notion appears in premise 1 and in premise 2. And for the argument to be plausible, then the power or ability to ensure that an action will happen has to be a necessary condition for the action to be free, and it has to be such that an agent in an indeterministic world, an agent whose actions are partly indeterministic, doesn't have that ability. And Franklin argues that there's no way of spelling out what this here means such that these conditions here are both fulfilled. And therefore the insurance formulation is not a threat to libertarianism. And so Franklin looks at different proposals, and one proposal he focuses on is the notion of antecedent control. And antecedent control is defined as follows. So the definition says that an agent S has antecedent control over an action A at time t, t2, just in case S has the power at t1 to F at t1, and if he F'd at t1, then F would deterministically bring about A at t2. So it's a very simple proposal. For you to have antecedent control over A, there needs to be a different action at an earlier time that you could perform, and if you were to perform that action, it would deterministically cause A. But then first Franklin notes that this definition here is ambiguous between whether you merely need the ability to perform that earlier action that would deterministically cause A, or do you need ability and opportunity. And that traces back to a distinction Franklin has drawn in an earlier chapter, as you remember. And Franklin argues that even if indeterminism is true, an agent still has the relevant ability. And I've been slightly skeptical about that, but I've posted that in the PDF document I've uploaded. So I'll set that aside. Then the real force of Franklin's argument comes because he concedes that an agent in a deterministic world doesn't have the opportunity to exercise antecedent control, but Franklin argues that the opportunity to perform F, the opportunity to exert antecedent control, is plausibly not a necessary condition for free will. And so it doesn't rule out free will under indeterminism that the relevant agents don't have the opportunity to exercise antecedent control. And let's look at why Franklin thinks that. Well, first of all, Franklin points out that antecedent control can be read in 2 different ways. We can read it as free antecedent control, where to have antecedent control over A, you need to be able to perform a free action at an earlier time that would deterministically cause A, the action. And Franklin thinks that this is a bad way of understanding it because it leads to a regress, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the second proposal is what he called mere antecedent control, and there, to have mere antecedent control over A, all you need to be able to do is to have the opportunity to perform an earlier action F that would deterministically cause A, but now F doesn't need to be a free action, it can be any kind of action. And here Franklin thinks that that's not a plausible necessary condition about free will. So let's look at the 2 proposals in turn. So first, what's the problem with understanding antecedent control in terms of free antecedent control? And Franklin points out that if you understand it this way, it leads to an infinite regress, because then for an action A, so the proposal is that free antecedent control is a necessary condition for an action being free. And so for A to be a free action, the agent has to be able to perform an earlier free action B that would deterministically cause A. But since B needs to be a free action, and since free antecedent control is a necessary condition on a free action, for B to be a free action, the agent has to be able to perform an earlier free action C that deterministically causes B. But of course, since C is a free action, for C to be free, there has to be an earlier condition D, an earlier action D that would deterministically cause C. And since D also needs to be free, now you see where this is going. So basically, for an agent to ever perform a free action, she would have to have performed infinitely other free actions at an earlier time. So that is not a good proposal. So then we are back to the second way of understanding antecedent control as mere antecedent control. So mere antecedent control still requires that for A to be free, you have to be able to perform an earlier action B that deterministically causes A, but now B no longer has to be free, and so you don't face any kind of regress worries. But Franklin's worry now is that it's just totally unclear why this should be a necessary condition on free will. Why should a requirement on your action A being free be that you are able to perform an earlier action that deterministically causes A? So how could that possibly make your action A more free, that you are able to perform an earlier action that deterministically causes A? And Franklin's idea is, since B itself is not a free action, the mere fact that you can perform a non-free action that would deterministically cause A, it's totally unclear why that would make A free. So he thinks that mere antecedent control is not a plausible necessary condition on free action. And so he thinks that the insurance formulation of the luck argument fails either way, no matter how we understand antecedent control. It's just not a plausible argument. And I have some misgivings with Franklin's discussion. So the intuitive idea of antecedent control is that to have control over an action, you need to you need to have the power to deterministically cause the action. And the way Franklin spells this out here in both proposals he gives us is that you have to have the power to perform another action that would deterministically cause the action. But that's just a whole difference between merely having the power to deterministically cause the action and then spelling it out in terms of having to perform another action that deterministically causes the action. So maybe you can see that about thinking about the power to see. So a lot of us have the power to see, but having the power to see doesn't mean that you could perform some action that would cause you to see. It seems to see, you don't have to perform any action at all. It just happens automatically. You just see. There are just conditions inside you that cause you to see. But these conditions don't have to involve you performing any kind of action that would cause you to see. And if that's true, then if antecedent control over A is merely the power to deterministically cause A, then we don't have to spell this out in terms of the power to perform another action. We simply say it's the idea of your reasons or your deliberations, something happening inside you that's not an action deterministically bringing about A. And if we understand antecedent control over A like this, then it does sound like it might be something like a necessary condition for free will, and it's not met in an indeterministic world, at least not according to Franklin's definition of what free will is. And so Franklin simply hasn't ruled out why that isn't a plausible way of understanding antecedent control. And it's a very natural way of understanding it, so it's somewhat strange that he doesn't discuss it. But I hope that gives you some kind of idea of how the insurance formulation of the luck argument works. And I'll see you again in the next lecture when we talk about the rollback formulation.